The Alpha King believed his heirs were born cursed. The pack healers whispered that the moon goddess herself had marked the triplets for death. For 5 unbearable years, the 3 pups screamed in agony every dawn, their cries echoing through the stone corridors of Ironwood Fortress until King Kaelan Ironwood ordered them sealed away in the Eastern Tower, a shameful secret rotting behind locked doors. Then came Elara, an Omega nurse with calloused hands and nothing left to fear. She didn't trust the whispers. She trusted her instincts. And when she defied the king's explicit command to leave the triplets untouched, her fingertips grazed something foreign buried beneath their bloodied fur. It wasn't muscle. It wasn't scar tissue. It was the cold, sharp point of a blackened silver fragment driven deep into each tiny spine. What she extracted that night wouldn't just heal 3 broken children. It would shatter a conspiracy and crown a queen. Before you tighten your seatbelt, take a moment to subscribe, only if you enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comment where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Your support proves I'm not wasting my time creating stories. Now let's continue. The obsidian walls of the Ironwood Fortress rose like ancient tombstones against the bruised sky, daring anyone desperate enough to seek refuge within. For Elara, an Omega with worn boots and an expired travel permit, desperation wasn't a choice, it was survival. She needed this position. The mountain wind bit through her thin green tunic as she navigated the servants' path toward the fortress entrance. She had heard the stories, naturally. Everyone in the Northern Territories had. Alpha King Kaelan Ironwood was a warrior wrapped in black armor, a merciless conqueror who had expanded his territory through blood and iron. But it was his private tragedy that servants whispered about over kitchen fires. His mate had vanished under mysterious circumstances. His triplet heirs, the future of the Obsidian Pack, were declared defective, hidden away like diseased livestock. Some claimed the pups were feral. Others said they bore physical deformities so grotesque that even their own father refused to look upon them. Elara pulled her canvas bag closer as she crossed the threshold into the dimly lit service corridor. The job posting had been strangely specific: Omega nurse needed. Must be willing to work in isolation. Previous candidates did not fulfill contract terms. The head housekeeper, a graying woman with suspicious eyes, led Elara through winding passages that smelled of damp stone and old violence. The Eastern Tower nursery, the woman said without looking back. You'll tend the king's children. You do not speak to them. You do not touch them beyond what's necessary for basic cleaning. And you certainly don't ask questions. Why did the last nurse leave? Elara asked. The housekeeper stopped at an iron-reinforced door. She didn't leave. She ran. The woman produced a heavy key ring. The screaming starts at dawn. Every dawn. It never stops until they exhaust themselves. The king believes it's their nature, that they're too weak to survive the shift, too broken to ever lead. The lock turned with a grinding echo. But between you and me? The housekeeper's voice dropped to a whisper. I've served this pack for 40 years. I've seen curses, and I've seen cruelty. What's happening to those pups isn't the moon goddess's doing. The door swung open, releasing a wave of fetid air, the unmistakable scent of infection, unwashed bodies, and something metallic that made Elara's wolf recoil. Inside, 3 small forms huddled in the shadows, their ribs visible through matted fur, their amber eyes reflecting the torchlight with a mixture of pain and primal terror. The housekeeper handed Elara a bucket and rags. You have until dawn. After that, you'll understand why no one stays. The door slammed shut. Elara stood alone in the diseased silence, studying the 3 pups who watched her with the wariness of creatures that had learned touch meant agony. The largest triplet, a male with darker markings, bared his tiny fangs in warning. The 2 others pressed against the far wall, trembling. She had been hired to clean them, to maintain them like furniture. But as Elara knelt slowly on the cold stone floor, extending one hand with her palm open and unthreatening, she made a decision that would rewrite the fate of the Obsidian Pack. She would listen. She would look. And she would find out what everyone else had been too afraid, or too complicit, to discover. Chapter 1. Dawn arrived like an executioner's blade. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the narrow window slits, and the screaming began. Not the crying of normal children, This was primal, guttural agony that seemed to tear from the very marrow of their bones. The eldest triplet thrashed against the stone floor, his small body convulsing as if trying to escape his own skin. The other two joined in a chorus of suffering that made Elara's hands shake as she gripped the edge of the wooden basin. She had stayed through the night, watching them sleep in fitful intervals, their breathing shallow and labored. But now, as dawn transformed the room from shadow to cruel light, she understood why the previous nurses had fled. This wasn't weakness. This was torture set to a celestial clock. The king's orders echoed in her mind: observe, clean from a distance, report any deaths. Nothing more. But Elara had spent the dark hours studying the triplets, noting how they flinched away from their own shadows, how they positioned themselves to avoid putting weight on their backs, how their whimpers seemed to originate from deep within their spines rather than their throats. The eldest male had finally collapsed into exhausted silence, his flanks heaving, foam speckling his muzzle. This was her moment. Elara moved quickly, dampening a cloth in the basin of lukewarm water mixed with chamomile, something to mask her scent and calm the nervous system. The housekeeper had provided harsh lye soap, but Elara had smuggled in her own supplies, herbs she'd collected from the mountain forests during her journey. She approached the exhausted pup with the fluid movements of someone who understood predator instincts. Low, slow, non-threatening. His amber eyes tracked her, too tired to snarl, but the warning was clear in every tense muscle. Don't touch me. Touch means pain. Elara knelt beside him and began with his paws, wiping away the crusted filth and dried blood. He trembled but didn't pull away, likely too depleted to mount a defense. She worked methodically, murmuring soft nonsense words that meant nothing but carried the tone of safety. As she moved along his ribcage, she felt the irregular bumps beneath his skin. Not the normal contours of a growing wolf pup, but something foreign, something wrong. Her fingers traced higher, to the base of his neck where the fur grew thick and matted with what she'd assumed was dirt. But as she carefully worked the cloth through the tangles, her fingertips brushed against something hard. Cold. Metallic. Her breath caught. She parted the fur with gentle precision, revealing skin that was inflamed and discolored, and there, just visible beneath the surface, was a dark point emerging from the flesh like a splinter from hell itself. Elara's medical training warred with disbelief. She retrieved her small leather kit, extracting a pair of fine tweezers that had belonged to her grandmother. The pup's eyes widened as she positioned the instrument, and for a heartbeat, she thought he might bite. Instead, he went perfectly still, as if some ancient instinct told him this touch was different. She gripped the exposed tip and pulled. The resistance was immediate and sickening. Whatever this was had been embedded deep, grown over with scar tissue from years of the body's failed attempts to expel it. Elara braced her other hand against the pup's shoulder and applied steady pressure. The fragment began to slide free, inch by excruciating inch, until finally it emerged with a wet sound that turned her stomach. In her trembling hand lay a blackened silver shard, nearly 4 inches long, its tip cruelly barbed to prevent natural extraction. And as she held it up to the dawn light, dried blood still clinging to its length, the pup behind her drew his first full breath in 5 years and didn't scream. The eldest triplet watched her with new eyes, no longer clouded with pain but sharp with cautious intelligence. Elara set the bloodied fragment on the stone floor and turned to the other 2 pups, who had witnessed the extraction with the absolute stillness of prey animals sensing a shift in their reality. She had no time for gentleness now, no luxury of building trust. If 1 fragment meant intentional cruelty, 3 meant systematic assassination. The middle pup, a female with a white blaze across her muzzle, approached first. She sniffed Elara's outstretched hand, then pressed her small head against Elara's palm in a gesture of heartbreaking surrender. The youngest male remained against the wall, his breathing rapid and shallow, but he didn't resist when Elara gathered him close. His whimper cut through her resolve like a blade, but her hands remained steady as she located the matching protrusion beneath his matted fur. The second extraction went faster. Her technique had improved, her angle more precise. The female's shard came out clean, and the pup collapsed against Elara's chest, shaking with something that might have been relief or shock or both. 2 fragments now lay on the floor, their silver surfaces tarnished black from years of poisoning young blood. She was reaching for the youngest male, positioning her tweezers against the raised inflammation on his spine, when the iron door exploded inward with enough force to crack the stone frame. Alpha King Kaelan Ironwood filled the doorway like a living shadow, his black armor catching the morning light, his presence so commanding that Alara's Omega instincts screamed at her to bare her throat and submit. Behind him stood a woman in midnight blue silk, her beauty sharp as cut glass, her expression perfectly calibrated between concern and triumph. Lady Vespera, the king's lunar elect. Alara had never met her, but she recognized the predatory grace of someone who wore power like a second skin. "What have you done?" Kaelan's voice was gravel and winter storms, each word carrying the weight of absolute authority. His eyes fixed on the silver fragments, then on Alara's blood-stained hands, then on the triplets who huddled behind her with unprecedented coherence. For 5 years they had been feral, separate, barely functional. Now they moved as a unit, defensive and aware. Alara rose slowly, the tweezers still gripped in her hand, the youngest pup's extraction incomplete. "Your Majesty, I can explain. She's been torturing them." Vespera's voice was honey over arsenic as she glided into the room, her silk skirts whispering against stone. She gestured to the bloody instruments, the fragments, the pup's fresh wounds. "I came to check on the heirs as I do every week, and I heard screaming. When I fetched the king, we find this. This Omega has been experimenting on defenseless children." "No." The word tore from Alara's throat. "Those fragments were already inside them. Years old. I was removing. Vespera's laugh was musical and vicious. "Or inserting. Tell me, Omega, where does a lowly nurse acquire blackened silver? It's banned in the Pack territories, is it not? A substance so toxic that even touching it can kill a wolf over time." She turned to Kaelan, her hand resting on his armored forearm with practiced intimacy. "My king, she's been poisoning your heirs. Slowly. Deliberately. Perhaps hoping to position herself as their savior when they inevitably died." Kaelan's eyes, ice blue and merciless, fixed on Alara with an intensity that made her bones ache. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop as his alpha aura manifested, a physical force that drove her to her knees. She fought it, her own hidden bloodline surging in resistance, but she was exhausted from a sleepless night and no match for a king in his own fortress. "Guards," Kaelan said quietly, and the word carried more menace than any shout. 4 armored wolves appeared in the doorway. "Take her to the dungeons. At dawn tomorrow, she burns for crimes against the crown." Alara's protest died as rough hands seized her arms, wrenching the tweezers from her grip. The youngest triplet still had silver buried in his spine. The evidence of the true crime lay scattered on the floor. But as she was dragged backward through the door, she watched Vespera kneel gracefully and begin gathering the fragments with a cloth, her smile small and satisfied as she erased the only proof of a conspiracy 5 years in the making. The dungeons beneath Ironwood Fortress smelled of old death and newer despair. Alara was thrown into a cell carved from raw stone, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed through her chest. No trial. No investigation. Just the king's word, absolute as winter, and her execution scheduled for dawn. She had perhaps 12 hours left to breathe. Above, in the throne room, Kaelan Ironwood stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked his territory, his reflection a dark specter against the mountain landscape. He had dismissed the guards, needing solitude to contain the fury that threatened to crack his carefully maintained control. For 5 years he had searched for answers. For 5 years he had watched his heirs suffer, had consulted every healer and mystic in the northern territories, had prayed to a moon goddess who seemed to have abandoned his bloodline entirely. And now this. An Omega nurse, in his employ for less than a day, had been torturing them further. The evidence was irrefutable, her hands covered in their blood, the banned silver in her possession, the fresh wounds on their small bodies. Vespera entered quietly, carrying a silver tray with wine and the cloth-wrapped fragments. She had changed from her silk gown into something simpler, more appropriate for comforting a grieving king. "My love," she said softly, setting the tray on his desk. "I've secured the evidence. The Pack Council will want to see it before the execution." Kaelan didn't turn from the window. "I should have been there sooner. I should have checked on them myself instead of delegating their care to strangers." "You couldn't have known." Vespera moved closer, her hand resting on his shoulder with gentle pressure. The Omega was clever. She likely planned this for weeks, perhaps months. Gained employment specifically to harm them. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. Though I confess, I don't understand her motive. What does a lowly nurse gain from crippling the heirs of the Obsidian Pack? Ransom. Revenge. Madness. Kaelin's jaw clenched. The reason doesn't matter. She touched my children. She hurt them. The windows rattled in their frames as his aura spiked, his wolf surging beneath his skin with the need for violence, for justice, for blood. Vespera's fingers tightened on his shoulder. The triplets are resting now. I gave them a mild sedative from the medical wing, something to help them sleep through the trauma. By tomorrow, this will be over. The Omega will burn, and we can finally move forward. She circled to face him, her expression earnest and beautiful in the firelight. Perhaps it's time to consider alternative heirs. If the triplets have been compromised beyond healing, the pack needs security. Our union could provide. No. The word was absolute. Kaelin finally met her eyes, and Vespera saw something in his gaze that made her step back. They are my blood. They will heal. And whoever is responsible for their suffering will pay for every moment of their pain. Vespera lowered her eyes in apparent submission, but her lips curved into the slightest smile as she moved toward the door. Of course, my king. I only want what's best for the pack. She paused at the threshold. I'll ensure the execution is handled properly. You shouldn't have to witness it yourself. Let me bear that burden for you. Kaelin turned back to the window, to the darkness gathering over his mountains. Dawn, he said quietly. Make it quick. She doesn't deserve mercy, but I won't have her suffer. Vespera's smile widened as she slipped into the corridor. Quick indeed. And with the Omega's death, the last person who could expose the truth would be ash on the wind. Elara sat in the darkness with her back against stone that wept with centuries of condensation, her wrists raw from the iron shackles that bound her to the wall. The dungeon was silent except for the occasional drip of water and the distant sound of guards changing watch. She should have been planning escape, bargaining with fate, praying to the moon goddess for intervention. Instead, she felt something else entirely, a burning in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with fury. The youngest triplet still had silver in his spine. She had been dragged away before finishing the extraction, before saving him from the dawn screaming that would come in mere hours. Those 3 children, tortured for years while their father believed them cursed, while the entire pack turned away in shame. And Vespera, that silk-wrapped viper, had manipulated the evidence so perfectly that Elara would burn for exposing the crime. The burning in her chest intensified. Her grandmother's voice echoed through memory, words spoken in secret when Elara was barely old enough to understand. You come from the old bloodline, child. The packbinders who could sense the bonds between wolves, who could feel the breaking of pack threads like physical wounds. That blood sleeps in you now, but one day when you need it most, it will wake. Elara had dismissed it as folklore, the romantic fantasies of an old woman who wanted her granddaughter to feel special. But now, as her rage built against the injustice poisoning this fortress, she felt something ancient stirring beneath her skin. The triplets were suffering. Their pack bond to their father was corrupted by lies. And she could feel it, a distant thrumming in her blood that connected her to those 3 small lives with an intensity that defied logic. The shackles grew warm against her wrists. Elara looked down and watched with stunned fascination as hairline cracks began to spread across the iron like frost patterns on glass. The burning in her chest became a roar, and suddenly she understood. This wasn't Omega submission or Nurse's compassion. This was something far older and infinitely more dangerous. She pulled against the chains, and they shattered. The sound was impossibly loud in the confined space, but Elara was already moving to the wall itself, pressing her palms against the ancient stone. She thought of the triplets, of their amber eyes watching her with desperate hope, of the youngest male who still suffered because she had failed him. The packbinder fury surged through her veins like liquid fire, and the stone began to crack. It should have been impossible. Stone that had held prisoners for centuries, walls built by the first ironwood alphas with magic and mortar meant to contain even the strongest wolves. But Elara wasn't trying to escape, she was trying to reach them. And that distinction, that pure intention, made all the difference. The wall crumbled beneath her hands, decades of mortar turning to dust, massive blocks shifting and falling away as if they were nothing more than river stones. She tore through 2 feet of solid rock, then 3, her hands bleeding and raw but no longer quite human. When she finally broke through into a narrow service tunnel, the ancient magic receded, leaving her gasping and trembling on her knees. But she was free. And somewhere above her, 3 children were counting down to a dawn that would bring screaming, unless she reached them first. Elara stood, her Omega nurse's demeanor burned away to reveal something far more primal, and began to climb toward the eastern tower through passages that only desperation could navigate. The service tunnels were a labyrinth of forgotten architecture, but Elara's newly awakened senses guided her through the darkness with uncanny precision. She could feel the triplets above her, their life forces like 3 flickering candles in the vast stone fortress, and that connection pulled her forward even when exhaustion threatened to drag her down. But as she navigated a junction where 3 passages converged, another sensation stopped her cold. A wrongness that radiated from somewhere to her left, a corruption in the pack bonds that made her teeth ache. The medical wing. She could sense it now, could feel the residue of lies and falsified records hanging in the air like poison. If Vespera had hidden the silver fragments so efficiently, she must have also ensured the official medical documentation supported her narrative. But 5 years of torture couldn't happen without leaving traces, and if Elara was going to save herself and the triplets, she needed proof that even a king couldn't ignore. She emerged from the tunnels into a storage room adjacent to the medical archives, her timing fortunate. The night shift had rotated, and the hallway beyond stood empty. Elara moved quickly, her bloodied hands leaving prints on the door frame as she slipped into the records chamber. Rows of wooden filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled with meticulous efficiency. She found the royal family section and pulled the triplets file with shaking fingers. The records were extensive. Birth documentation, wellness checks, incident reports spanning 5 years. But it was the imaging studies that made Elara's blood run cold. X-rays, dated systematically from the triplets' 2nd month of life through last week, showed their small spines with clinical clarity. And in every single image, visible as dark shadows against bone, were the silver fragments. They had been there from the beginning, growing more embedded with each passing year, and every pack doctor who had examined these children had seen them. Elara spread the X-rays across the examination table, her hands trembling with rage. This wasn't oversight. This was conspiracy. Someone had ordered the doctors to remain silent, had ensured that every medical professional who might have helped was either complicit or terrified into submission. She began rolling the X-rays carefully, but a sound in the hallway froze her in place. Footsteps, measured and purposeful, accompanied by the rustle of expensive fabric. "I told you the sedative would keep them quiet until morning." Vespera's voice drifted through the partially open door. "The Omega's execution will proceed as planned, and by noon, we'll have convinced the king that the triplets are too damaged to rule." Another voice, male and uncertain, responded. "My lady, falsifying medical records is one thing, but if anyone discovers the fragments were present from infancy, no one will discover anything because there will be nothing to discover." Vespera's tone sharpened. "You've been well compensated for your silence, Dr. Thorne. Continue to earn it, or join the Omega on the pyre." Elara's mind raced. She couldn't take the entire file, its absence would be noticed immediately. But she could take what mattered most. She selected the earliest X-ray, showing 2-month-old pups already embedded with silver, and the most recent, showing the progression of poisoning. She rolled them tightly and tucked them into her tunic just as the door began to open. There was no time for subtlety. Elara grabbed a glass beaker from the examination table and hurled it through the far window. The crash was spectacular, glass exploding outward into the courtyard, and Vespera's startled curse was followed by running footsteps moving away from Elara's position. She slipped back into the storage room and down into the tunnels as alarm bells began to ring throughout the fortress. The X-rays pressed against her ribs like a promise. She had the proof now, evidence that would damn Vespera and exonerate her own actions. But first, she had to survive long enough to show it to the one person whose opinion mattered, the king himself. And to do that, She needed to reach the triplets before Vespera realized her carefully constructed lies were unraveling. Elara ran through the darkness, following the pull of 3 small souls who were counting on her to be more than just a nurse, more than just an Omega. They needed her to be what her bloodline had always been. A packbinder who could mend what had been deliberately broken, even if it meant standing against a king's fury and a villain's cunning to do it. The king's private study occupied the highest tower of the fortress, accessible only through a guarded stairwell and a corridor lined with portraits of dead alphas whose eyes seemed to follow intruders with judgment. Elara climbed with her packbinder senses stretched thin, feeling for the threads that connected Kaelin to his pack, to his children, to the truth he couldn't yet see. What she found instead was something darker, a poisonous influence wrapping around the king's consciousness like strangling vines, dulling his instincts, clouding his judgment. She reached the outer chamber and pressed herself against the wall as 2 guards passed, their conversation focused on the escaped prisoner and the fortress-wide search. The moment they rounded the corner, Elara slipped toward the study door, which stood slightly ajar. Candlelight flickered from within, and she could hear Vespera's voice, smooth as silk over steel. "You've barely touched your wine, my love. You need rest before the execution. Let me help ease your burden." The clink of crystal followed her words. Elara peered through the gap and felt her blood turn to ice. Kaelin sat at his desk, still in his black armor, his expression haggard with grief and rage. Before him stood Vespera in a gown of deep crimson, holding 2 goblets of wine. But it was the small vial partially hidden in her palm that made Elara's breath catch, dark glass with a purple residue that could only be one thing: Wolf's Bane. Not enough to kill, but enough to fog judgment, to make an alpha susceptible to suggestion, to ensure he wouldn't question the convenient death of an Omega who knew too much. "The triplets will need you to be strong tomorrow," Vespera continued, circling behind Kaelin to set 1 goblet before him. "After the execution, we can finally discuss their future. Perhaps a specialist from the southern packs, someone who can assess whether they're salvageable as heirs." She raised her own goblet in a toast. "To justice. And to new beginnings." Kaelin reached for his wine, and Elara moved without thinking. She burst through the door with enough force to splinter the frame, her voice cutting through the intimate scene like a blade. "Don't drink that." The king was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the sword at his hip, his eyes blazing with alpha fury at the intrusion. Vespera's carefully crafted expression of shock was almost perfect, but Elara saw the flash of genuine rage beneath it, the frustration of a predator whose prey had slipped the trap 1 time too many. "The escaped prisoner," Vespera gasped, stepping back with theatrical alarm. "Guards! The Omega has come to finish what she started. I came to save your life." Elara's voice was steady despite her racing heart. She pulled the rolled X-rays from her tunic and held them up, her other hand pointing at Vespera's goblet. "She's poisoning you, Your Majesty. Wolf's Bane in your wine. Just enough to cloud your judgment, to make you compliant while she eliminates anyone who threatens her plans." Kaelin's eyes flickered to the wine, then to Vespera, who had gone utterly still. "Ridiculous," she said softly. "The Omega is desperate, grasping at fantasies to avoid her fate. She tortured your children, and now she accuses me of—" "I have proof." Elara unrolled the X-rays with shaking hands, holding them up to the candlelight where the shadows of silver fragments showed clearly against tiny spines. "These are dated from when the triplets were 2 months old. The fragments I removed, the ones you claim I inserted, have been in their bodies for 5 years. Every doctor in this fortress knew. They were all complicit or terrified into silence." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Kaelin moved to examine the X-rays, his warrior's instincts warring with the poisoned affection Vespera had cultivated over years of careful manipulation. Elara could feel the battle raging within him through her packbinder senses. Loyalty against truth, love against evidence, grief against the growing realization that he had been catastrophically deceived. "She's forged them," Vespera said, but her voice had lost its honey sweetness, taking on an edge of desperation. "She broke into the medical wing, the alarms, the broken window. She stole records and altered them. My king, you know me. You know my devotion to you and your heirs." Elara met Kaelin's ice-blue eyes, and in that moment, she made a choice that could either save them all or end with her heart torn from her chest. She dropped every shield her Omega nature had built, letting her packbinder bloodline blaze forth in its full, ancient glory. "Test the wine," she said quietly. "And then let me show you what I really am, and what's been done to your children in the darkness while you were blinded by a traitor's smile." The silence stretched like a blade against throat. Then Kaelin picked up his goblet, walked to the window, and poured the wine onto the stone sill. Where the liquid touched, the ancient rock began to smoke and blacken, the unmistakable reaction of Wolf's Bane meeting enchanted stone. The king turned slowly, and the expression on his face was no longer one of rage directed at Elara. It was something far more terrifying, the cold, calculating fury of an alpha who had just realized his mate was his enemy. The king's private study occupied the highest tower of the fortress, accessible only through a guarded stairwell and a corridor lined with portraits of dead alphas whose eyes seemed to follow intruders with judgment. Elara climbed with her packbinder senses stretched thin, feeling for the threads that connected Kaelin to his pack, to his children, to the truth he couldn't yet see. What she found instead was something darker, a poisonous influence wrapping around the king's consciousness like strangling vines, dulling his instincts, clouding his judgment. She reached the outer chamber and pressed herself against the wall as two guards passed, their conversation focused on the escaped prisoner and the fortress-wide search. The moment they rounded the corner, Elara slipped toward the study door, which stood slightly ajar. Candlelight flickered from within, and she could hear Vespera's voice, smooth as silk over steel. "You've barely touched your wine, my love. You need rest before the execution. Let me help ease your burden." The clink of crystal followed her words. Elara peered through the gap and felt her blood turn to ice. Kaelin sat at his desk, still in his black armor, his expression haggard with grief and rage. Before him stood Vespera in a gown of deep crimson, holding two goblets of wine. But it was the small vial partially hidden in her palm that made Elara's breath catch, dark glass with a purple residue that could only be one thing: Wolf's Bane. Not enough to kill, but enough to fog judgment, to make an alpha susceptible to suggestion, to ensure he wouldn't question the convenient death of an Omega who knew too much. "The triplets will need you to be strong tomorrow," Vespera continued, circling behind Kaelin to set one goblet before him. "After the execution, we can finally discuss their future. Perhaps a specialist from the southern packs, someone who can assess whether they're salvageable as heirs." She raised her own goblet in a toast. "To justice. And to new beginnings." Kaelin reached for his wine, and Elara moved without thinking. She burst through the door with enough force to splinter the frame, her voice cutting through the intimate scene like a blade. "Don't drink that." The king was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the sword at his hip, his eyes blazing with alpha fury at the intrusion. Vespera's carefully crafted expression of shock was almost perfect, but Elara saw the flash of genuine rage beneath it, the frustration of a predator whose prey had slipped the trap one time too many. "The escaped prisoner," Vespera gasped, stepping back with theatrical alarm. "Guards! The Omega has come to finish what she started. I came to save your life." Elara's voice was steady despite her racing heart. She pulled the rolled X-rays from her tunic and held them up, her other hand pointing at Vespera's goblet. "She's poisoning you, Your Majesty. Wolf's Bane in your wine. Just enough to cloud your judgment, to make you compliant while she eliminates anyone who threatens her plans." Kaelin's eyes flickered to the wine, then to Vespera, who had gone utterly still. "Ridiculous," she said softly. "The Omega is desperate, grasping at fantasies to avoid her fate. She tortured your children, and now she accuses me of—" "I have proof." Elara unrolled the X-rays with shaking hands, holding them up to the candlelight where the shadows of silver fragments showed clearly against tiny spines. "These are dated from when the triplets were 2 months old. The fragments I removed, the ones you claim I inserted, have been in their bodies for 5 years. Every doctor in this fortress knew. They were all complicit or terrified into silence." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Kaelin moved to examine the X-rays, his warrior's instincts warring with the poisoned affection Vespera had cultivated over years of careful manipulation. Elara could feel the battle raging within him through her packbinder senses. Loyalty against truth, love against evidence, grief against the growing realization that he had been catastrophically deceived. "She's forged them," Vespera said, But her voice had lost its honey sweetness, taking on an edge of desperation. She broke into the medical wing, the alarms, the broken window. She stole records and altered them. My king, you know me. You know my devotion to you and your heirs. Elara met Kaelin's ice-blue eyes, and in that moment, she made a choice that could either save them all or end with her heart torn from her chest. She dropped every shield her Omega nature had built, letting her packbinder bloodline blaze forth in its full, ancient glory. Test the wine, she said quietly. And then let me show you what I really am, and what's been done to your children in the darkness while you were blinded by a traitor's smile. The silence stretched like a blade against throat. Then Kaelin picked up his goblet, walked to the window, and poured the wine onto the stone sill. Where the liquid touched, the ancient rock began to smoke and blacken, the unmistakable reaction of Wolf's Bane meeting enchanted stone. The king turned slowly, and the expression on his face was no longer one of rage directed at Elara. It was something far more terrifying, the cold, calculating fury of an alpha who had just realized his mate was his enemy. They ran through the fortress corridors together, guards parting before their king with confused deference, their questions dying on their lips at the sight of his expression. Elara, Anna, felt the triplets stirring in the eastern tower, felt the familiar dread building in their small bodies as dawn approached. But Kaelin grabbed her arm as they passed his personal chambers, pulling her inside with urgent purpose. There's something you need to see first, he said, his voice rough with emotion. He moved to a locked cabinet beside his bed and retrieved a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. My mother's diary. She died when I was young, but she left this with instructions that I read it only when I found my true mate. His eyes met Anna's, and the mate bond between them thrummed with recognition that had been poisoned and suppressed for too long. I read it the night after you arrived at the fortress. When my wolf wouldn't let me sleep because something felt different, felt right for the first time in years. Anna took the journal with trembling hands and opened it to the pages marked with a black ribbon. The handwriting was elegant but urgent, dated 5 years ago, the late Luna Miriam's final entries before her death. Her breath caught as she began to read aloud, needing Kaelin to hear the words as much as she needed to speak them. My son will not understand what I've done until it's too late to ask forgiveness. The girl who carries his children, Anna of the Packbinder line, is his true fated mate, though neither of them knows it yet. The bond was masked by Vespera's blood magic, hidden so completely that even I nearly missed the signs. But I am dying, and I see clearly now what I was too blind to see before. Anna's voice broke, but she continued. Vespera came to me as a trusted advisor when I grew ill, but she is no friend to this pack. She has been poisoning me slowly, ensuring my death would clear the path for her to become Luna. I discovered her plan too late to save myself, but not too late to protect the true heirs. The triplets Anna carries are the strongest bloodline our pack has seen in generations, Packbinder and Alpha King combined. Vespera knows this, fears this, and will stop at nothing to eliminate them. Kaelin's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles white. His mother had known, had tried to warn him. But he'd been too consumed with grief after her death to understand the message she'd left behind. Anna turned the page, her tears falling onto the aged paper. I have arranged for Anna to be hidden as a surrogate, her identity obscured, the mate bond suppressed by a talisman I've given her. After the birth, she must be sent away for her own protection until Vespera's true nature is exposed. My son, when you read this, know that I failed you. I thought I had more time to reveal Vespera's treachery, to bring Anna back into your life properly. But if you're reading this, it means I am gone and you have found your mate despite all obstacles. The talisman's power fades with true danger. When she is needed most, she will return. Trust the bond. Trust her. And forgive me for the years you've lost. The final entry was brief, written in a shakier hand. The triplets were born healthy. 3 perfect pups with their father's strength and their mother's gift. Vespera discovered them before I could intervene. I fear what she will do. Tell Anna I'm sorry. Tell my son to be the king I raised him to be. And tell my grandchildren that their grandmother loved them, even if I couldn't save them from what's coming. The journal fell from Anna's hands as the full weight of understanding crashed down. Miriam had tried to protect them all, but Vespera's corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The late Luna had been murdered, Anna had been exiled with false memories, and the triplets had been tortured for 5 years. Also Vespera could claim a throne that was never meant to be hers. "She killed my mother," Kaelin said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of cold fury that preceded storms. "And then she spent 5 years torturing our children while I grieved and suspected nothing." Anna gripped his hand, the mate bond between them burning bright and clear now that the suppression had finally broken. "Your mother saved them by hiding me. If Vespera had known I was alive and aware, she would have finished what she started." She pulled him toward the door. "But we're both here now. And dawn is coming. Whatever else has been stolen from us, we can still save them from one more morning of screaming." They left the journal lying open on the bed, evidence and eulogy and explanation all at once, and ran together toward the eastern tower where 3 children were waking to face a dawn that, for the first time in their young lives, would bring their true parents instead of agony. The nursery door flew open as the first true rays of dawn touched the eastern windows, but this time the screaming didn't come. Kaelin and Anna burst into the room to find the triplets huddled together, trembling in anticipation of pain that had become as reliable as sunrise itself. But when they saw their father, truly saw him, not as the distant king who had abandoned them but as the man whose scent now mingled with the Omega nurse who had dared to help them, something shifted in their amber eyes. Anna dropped to her knees and opened her arms. The eldest male approached first, cautious but drawn by an instinct deeper than memory. When she wrapped him in her embrace, her packbinder gift flowing through the contact, he didn't flinch. He melted into her warmth with a whimper that spoke of 5 years of longing for exactly this touch. The other 2 followed, and soon Anna held all 3 against her chest while Kaelin knelt beside them, his massive hand gentle as he stroked matted fur that would soon be groomed and healthy and whole. "I'm so sorry," Anna whispered into their fur, her tears falling freely. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here. But I'm here now. We both are. And no one will ever hurt you again." The youngest male still had silver lodged in his spine. Anna could feel it like a splinter in her own flesh through the packbinder bond. With Kaelin supporting the pup's weight, she carefully extracted the final fragment, her movements sure and practiced now. When it came free, the youngest pup's entire body relaxed for the first time in his short life, and the sound he made was not a scream but something closer to a sigh of relief so profound it seemed to come from his very soul. The healing took 3 days. Anna remained in the nursery, using her packbinder gifts to cleanse the silver poisoning from their systems, to mend the damaged pack bonds that had been corrupted since birth. Kaelin rarely left her side, learning the children he had thought were broken, discovering their personalities emerging like flowers after a long winter. The eldest was protective and thoughtful. The female was curious and fierce. The youngest was gentle but possessed a stubborn determination that reminded Anna of herself. On the 4th day, they shifted for the first time without pain. The transformation that should have been natural at their age had been impossible with silver poisoning their systems, but now their small bodies flowed from pup to human child with the fluid grace of their royal bloodline. They were beautiful, dark-haired like their mother, with their father's striking ice-blue eyes, and the unmistakable aura of power that marked them as future alphas. The pack gathered in the Great Hall for the ceremony that would reshape the Obsidian Pack's future. Word had spread of Vespera's treachery, of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed the royal line, and of the packbinder Omega who had saved them all. The wolves who had turned their faces away from the cursed heirs now watched in awe as the triplets walked into the hall flanked by their parents, their heads high, their movements coordinated and strong. Kaelin stood before his pack with Anna at his side, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority earned through suffering and truth. "For 5 years, I was blind. Poisoned by lies and manipulation, I allowed evil to flourish in my own home. My mate was stolen from me. My children were tortured. My mother was murdered. All while I believed the pretty fiction that a traitor fed me day after day." He turned to Anna, and the mate bond between them blazed bright enough that even the weakest pack members could feel its power. "Anna of the packbinder line is my true mate, the mother of my heirs, and the savior of this pack. She defied my orders, risked her life, and tore down stone walls with her bare hands to protect children she couldn't even remember were her own. She is stronger than I ever was, braver than any warrior I've commanded, and more worthy of the crown than I have proven to be." Kaelin knelt before her, and a collective gasp rippled through the assembled wolves as their alpha king, who knelt for no one, bowed his head in acknowledgement of his mate's strength. Anna Ironwood, I ask you to stand beside me not as a rescued Omega, but as Alpha Queen. Rule with me. Guide me. Help me rebuild what was broken and ensure our children inherit a pack worthy of their gifts. Anna looked out at the sea of faces, wolves who had ignored the triplets screaming, who had believed the lies, who had been complicit through their silence. But she also saw the shame in their eyes, the determination to do better, and the hope that perhaps healing was possible even after so much had been destroyed. She placed her hand on Kaelin's shoulder, accepting not just a crown but the responsibility of leading wolves who had failed her children when they needed protection most. I accept, she said, her voice carrying through the hall with unexpected command. But know this, the Obsidian Pack will never again turn away from suffering. We will never again allow power to corrupt justice. And we will never again punish the innocent for the crimes of the guilty. The pack howled their acceptance, the sound rising through the fortress like a promise and a prayer. Kaelin rose and placed a crown of black iron and silver moonstone upon Anna's head, the metal warm from his hands. The triplets shifted to their human forms and stood between their parents, their hands clasped together, their eyes bright with the intelligence and strength that had been hidden beneath years of torture. The eldest spoke for the first time in the presence of the pack, his voice clear and strong. We are the heirs of the Obsidian Pack. We are Packbinder and Alpha King combined. And we will never forget what it means to suffer, so that we may rule with mercy as well as strength. The hall erupted in howls once more, and this time there was joy in the sound. The screaming that had marked every dawn for 5 years had finally ended, replaced by the promise of a new reign built on truth, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between a king who had learned humility and a queen who had learned her own power. The silver fragments were melted down and forged into a memorial in the courtyard, a reminder etched in metal and magic that sometimes the greatest threats come wrapped in beauty, and sometimes the greatest heroes arrive wearing the face of a humble nurse with nothing left to lose and everything worth fighting for.